I've always loved exploring places that feel forgotten by the world, but this time, it was different. Walking into some of these haunted locations made my heart race and my skin tingle in ways I hadn't expected. You won't believe what I saw at numbers 3 and 4, I've been to these spots myself, and the history, the silence, and the energy are real. Some moments made me stop and just catch my breath. If you think you've seen it all, wait until you hear the stories behind these 7 haunted places. Trust me, this will stay with you. If you love exploring real haunted places with me, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join the adventure. 1 Waverly Hills Sanatorium, Kentucky, USA. When I first stood outside Waverly Hills Sanatorium in Kentucky, the building felt heavier than I expected. It was quiet, but not the peaceful kind of quiet. The kind where your ears start listening harder because something feels wrong. The long brick structure sat on the hill like it was still watching the city below, just like it did decades ago. As I walked closer, I kept thinking about the people who once came here believing they would get better. In the early 1900s, this place was meant to treat tuberculosis patients. Back then, there was no cure. Fresh air and isolation were the only hope. Many patients never left. That thought stayed in my mind as I stepped inside. The air inside felt colder, even though it wasn't winter. The hallways were long and narrow, and my footsteps echoed back to me. I remember stopping for a moment, not because I was tired, but because I suddenly felt watched. I told myself it was just my imagination, but my body didn't believe that lie. I walked past old patient rooms, their paint peeling, their windows broken. I imagined someone lying there, staring out at the same hills I had just seen. Some reports say thousands died here. That number doesn't feel real until you stand where it happened. Then it feels too real. The place that affected me the most was the body chute, often called the death tunnel. It was used to quietly move bodies downhill so other patients wouldn't lose hope. Standing at the entrance, I felt a tight pressure in my chest. I wasn't scared yet, but I felt deeply uncomfortable, like I wasn't supposed to be there. People have reported hearing footsteps, doors slamming, and voices calling their names. I didn't hear a voice, but I did experience something strange. For a few seconds, the temperature dropped suddenly around me, like someone had walked through me. I froze. It passed quickly, but my heart didn't slow down for a long time. As I left Waverly Hills, I looked back one last time. I didn't see anything unusual, but I felt something. A deep sadness mixed with a quiet warning. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, this place carries real pain, real history, and real stories. And once you've been there, a part of it stays with you longer than you expect. 2 Poveglia Island, Venice, Italy. I first saw Poveglia Island from a small boat moving slowly through the Venetian lagoon. From a distance, it didn't look dramatic or frightening. It just looked empty. But the closer we got, the heavier the air felt. Even the water around the island was unusually still, as if sound itself didn't want to travel there. Poveglia has a long and documented history. The ground felt uneven under my feet, mixed with broken bricks and overgrown plants. Locals say the soil contains ash from bodies burned during the plague years. Standing there, that story didn't feel like a legend. It felt disturbingly possible. As I walked deeper, I saw the remains of old buildings slowly being taken back by nature. One structure stood taller than the rest, the former hospital. This is where many stories come from. Records confirm a mental health facility once operated here in the early 1900s. Over time, rumors grew about cruel treatments and a doctor who supposedly lost his mind. Those parts are legends, but the hospital itself is real, and that truth alone is unsettling. Inside, the temperature felt cooler. Not cold, just suddenly different. I remember stopping without realizing why. My chest felt tight, and for a moment, I felt a strong urge to leave. Nothing happened, yet everything felt wrong. That feeling was stronger than fear. It felt like the place was reminding me I didn't belong. People often talk about hearing screams or seeing shadows on Poveglia. I didn't experience anything like that. What I felt instead was deep sadness. This island wasn't angry. It felt tired. Like it had held too many final moments and never got a chance to rest. As the boat pulled away, I looked back at Poveglia. The buildings faded into the fog, but the feeling didn't fade with them. Poveglia doesn't need ghosts to be disturbing. Its real history is more than enough to leave a mark on anyone who visits, even long after they're gone. 3 Bhangarh Fort, Rajasthan, India. I reached Bhangarh Fort just before sunset, when the light starts turning soft and shadows grow longer. The road to the fort was quiet, and that silence felt intentional, like the place preferred fewer witnesses. A sign at the entrance warned visitors not to stay after dark. It didn't explain why, but it didn't need to. Bhangarh is a real historical site from the 17th century, built during the rule of Raja Madho Singh. What people talk about, though, are the legends that came later. As I walked through the stone gate, I kept reminding myself that these were stories passed down for generations. Still, knowing something is a legend doesn't stop your body from reacting. The fort was larger than I expected. Empty palaces, temples, and homes stood frozen in time. Wind moved through broken windows, creating low sounds that felt almost like whispers. I noticed how quickly my thoughts changed. At first, I was curious. Then, without warning, I felt uneasy, like I was being rushed by something I couldn't see. Locals often talk about a story involving a tantric who fell in love with a princess and tried to control her using dark practices. Historians confirm the princess existed, but the curse is part of folklore. Standing there, it was easy to see how such stories were born. The place feels abandoned in a sudden way, as if life left all at once. As I walked deeper into the ruins, I felt a strange pressure around my head, almost like a dull headache forming. It wasn't fear exactly. It was confusion, like my senses couldn't settle. I stopped near the remains of old homes and imagined families once living there, cooking, laughing, planning futures that never came. The most intense moment came when the wind suddenly stopped. Everything went still. No sound, no movement. For a few seconds, it felt like time had paused. I caught myself holding my breath without realizing it. Then the wind returned, and the moment passed, but my heart kept racing. When I finally turned back toward the exit, the sun was low. The fort looked different now, darker, heavier. I didn't see anything unusual, and nothing chased me out. But I understood why people don't stay after sunset. Bhangarh doesn't scare you with something you see. It unsettles you with what you feel. As I left, I didn't feel relief. I felt respect. Whatever truly happened here, the silence, the sudden abandonment, and the stories tied to this place are real enough to leave a lasting mark. Bhangarh Fort stays with you, not as a ghost story, but as an unanswered question. For Eastern State Penitentiary, Pennsylvania, USA. I walked through the front gate of Eastern State Penitentiary on a gray afternoon, and the first thing I noticed was how quiet it felt for a place sitting in the middle of a busy city. The stone walls were massive, cold, and unwelcoming. This prison opened in 1829, and standing there, it felt like time had slowed down instead of moved on. Inside, the cell blocks stretched out in long lines, each one fading into darkness. Eastern State was built around a system of solitary confinement. Prisoners were kept alone for years, sometimes decades, believing isolation would lead to reflection and reform. Knowing that made every step feel heavier. This wasn't just a prison. It was an experiment on the human mind. As I walked past the cells, I imagined what it must have been like to live here without voices, without touch, without light. Some former prisoners wrote about hearing things that weren't there. Historians confirm many inmates suffered mental breakdowns. That fact alone was disturbing enough, even before any haunted stories came into the picture. One cell that caught my attention was Al Capone's. It looked different from the rest, almost comfortable. Rugs, paintings, and furniture filled the small space. The contrast hit me hard. While some men lost their sanity in darkness, others lived here with privilege. As I stood in the center of the cell block, light poured in from the ceiling, creating long shadows across the floor. It was beautiful and unsettling at the same time. I felt a deep sadness rather than fear. This place didn't feel angry. It felt broken. When I finally stepped back outside, the noise of the city returned instantly. Cars, people, life. But something inside me stayed behind. Eastern State Penitentiary doesn't need ghosts to haunt you. Its real history, its isolation, and its silence follow you long after you leave, quietly reminding you of what humans are capable of doing to one another. 5 Hour of London, London, England. I arrived at the Tower of London early in the morning, when the city was awake but the crowds had not yet taken over. The stone walls rose high and solid, and for a moment I forgot I was standing in the heart of modern London. This place has stood here for nearly 1,000 years, and that weight of time is something you feel before you even step inside. As I walked through the gate, I thought about how many people entered this place without knowing they would never leave. Kings, queens, prisoners, soldiers, and traders all passed through the same path I was walking on. The ground beneath my feet felt worn down, not just by footsteps, but by history itself. The air inside the tower felt cooler, even though the sun was out. Guards moved calmly, tourists whispered, and yet there was a strange seriousness hanging in the space. I found myself lowering my voice without realizing it. This wasn't fear. It was respect mixed with unease. When I stood near Tower Green, everything slowed down in my mind. This is where executions took place, away from the public eye. And Bullen was executed here in 1536. That is a confirmed historical fact, not a legend. As I stood there, I tried to imagine her final moments. The thought tightened my chest, and for a second, I felt dizzy, like the past was pushing too close. People often talk about seeing shadows or hearing whispers at the tower. I didn't see anything like that. What I felt instead was a sudden emotional shift. My thoughts became heavy, almost sad, and it happened without warning. It felt like standing in a place where too many final goodbyes had already been said. As I moved deeper into the tower, the walls felt closer. The narrow rooms and staircases made it easy to understand how prisoners must have felt trapped, both physically and mentally. Some were held here for years, not knowing their fate. That uncertainty stayed with me as I walked. The moment that stayed with me most happened near one of the older stone corridors. Everything was normal, and then suddenly, all sound faded. It lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. I became aware of my own breathing, loud and fast. Then the noise returned, and people walked past me as if nothing had happened. When I finally stepped back outside, London felt louder than before. The tower remained silent behind me. I didn't feel scared walking away, but I felt changed. The Tower of London doesn't need ghost stories to feel haunted. Its real history, real deaths, and real suffering are powerful enough to stay with you long after you leave. 6 Aokigahara Forest, Mount Fuji, Japan. I stepped into Aokigahara Forest just as the morning fog was lifting. The air smelled earthy, wet, and heavy, like the forest itself was breathing slowly. From the start, I noticed how quiet it was, too quiet. There were no birds, no rustling animals, just the soft sound of my own footsteps on the moss-covered ground. It felt like the forest wanted to remind me I was not just a visitor, I was intruding. The forest is real, and so is its history. It has been called the Sea of Trees for centuries, but in recent years it became known for something darker. People come here to end their lives, and signs posted at the entrance urge anyone struggling to seek help. I kept reading about the bodies found here, the rescue teams, and the stories from locals. That knowledge weighed on me as I walked deeper, making each step feel heavier than the last. As I moved along the narrow path, I felt small. The trees grew tall and close together, their twisted roots creating natural obstacles. My mind kept racing with thoughts. I imagined someone walking the same path long before me, lost, sad, desperate. It wasn't fear that I felt, it was an overwhelming empathy, a realization of the weight carried by human lives. I tried to focus on the moss, the occasional stray bird, but the feeling stayed. I reached a small clearing, and for a moment, the fog lifted fully. Sunlight barely reached the ground. In that quiet, I could almost hear voices, not real ones, but echoes of pain that felt embedded in the forest. My heart started beating faster. I told myself it was my imagination, yet my body reacted as if something unseen was near. Walking further, I came across abandoned items, a backpack, some clothing, personal objects left behind. Each one felt like a story frozen in time. I picked up a small notebook lying near the trail and flipped through it briefly. Pages were blank or faded. It passed as quickly as it came, but I couldn't shake it for hours afterward. When I finally left Aokigahara, stepping back into the light and the sound of civilization, I didn't feel relief. I felt a strange respect and a quiet sadness. This forest doesn't need horror stories or legends. Its real history, the lives it has seen, and the silence it carries are haunting enough. And I knew that part of me would always hear it whenever I closed my eyes. 7 Edinburgh Castle, Scotland. I arrived at Edinburgh Castle just as the sun was dipping behind the hills, turning the sky into shades of gold and orange. The stone walls looked ancient and cold, as if they had absorbed every story and secret over the centuries. Walking up the steep path toward the entrance, I felt a mix of excitement and unease. This wasn't just a castle, it was a place where history, power, and tragedy collided. Once inside, I immediately noticed the narrow hallways and tight staircases. The corridors twisted and turned in ways that made it easy to feel lost, even for someone following a map. I imagined soldiers, prisoners, and royalty moving through these same spaces hundreds of years ago. The thought made my chest tighten. History was alive here, and it had a weight you could almost touch. I paused near one of the old stone rooms, where the walls still held the marks of time. Visitors often talk about strange cold spots and fleeting shadows, and for a moment, I felt a sudden chill run down my spine. I told myself it was nothing, just the stone holding on to the day's last sunlight. But my mind wouldn't stop thinking about the soldiers who had died here, the prisoners who had been kept in darkness, and the echoes of footsteps that might still linger in the hallways. As I moved deeper into the castle, I found myself staring at old cells and dungeons. The iron bars were rusted, the floors uneven. I crouched down and imagined the people who spent days, months, even years in these spaces. Some were waiting for trials, others were held without hope. It wasn't horror that struck me, it was empathy. The walls had witnessed pain on a scale I could hardly process. A moment later, I climbed to a high tower and looked out over the city. The streets below sparkled with lights, but up here, in the castle, the world felt paused. I felt a strange combination of awe and melancholy. Everything about Edinburgh Castle tells a story, but the silence makes you feel the untold ones too. I swear for a second I thought I saw a shadow move along the battlements, but when I blinked, it was gone. My heart raced, but my eyes saw nothing. That's when I realized how much the mind can play with the history it senses. The final part of my visit was the old chapel, empty and echoing. I stopped and breathed slowly, letting the silence settle over me. It wasn't scary, but it was unforgettable. Standing there, I felt the presence of everything that had happened before me. The triumphs, the betrayals, and the countless lives that had crossed through this fortress. The castle didn't need ghosts. Its past was haunting enough. When I finally walked back toward the gate, the city lights shone brighter, and the air felt warmer. Yet a part of me stayed behind, wandering those hallways, feeling the same tight chest, the same quiet weight. Edinburgh Castle leaves an imprint not because of legends, but because of the real people who lived, suffered, and left their mark long before we ever arrived.